I thank Ms. Goton for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Edem Wosornu.
Mr. President, humanitarian workers in Ukraine came under repeated attack last week. As mentioned by my DPPA colleague, 2 separate convoys clearly marked as being part of the United Nations were hit while carrying life-saving assistance to civilians in need. Both missions had been notified well in advance through established channels. On May 12, WFP struck that had delivered food to frontline communities was hit by a drone in Dnipro region, injuring the driver. On May 14, a United Nations vehicle on a humanitarian mission was struck by a drone in Kherson city. My OCHA and DSS colleagues were on that convoy. 20 minutes later, the vehicle without our colleagues was struck again. These brazen incidents are not isolated. In the same week, other humanitarian missions were hit, injuring humanitarian workers and damaging humanitarian assets. On May 14, a World Central Kitchen van delivering hot meals to civilians was hit, damaging the vehicle. On May 15, a Ukrainian NGO delivering food to a collective site was hit, injuring 2 people, one of whom remains in critical condition. Between January and April of this year, 3 humanitarian workers were killed, 10 others injured. These attacks are intensifying, making the delivery of humanitarian assistance increasingly difficult, if not impossible in some areas. Humanitarian workers in Ukraine are taking immense risks to save lives. However, the weapons being deployed, cheap, deadly, are rapidly changing what it means to deliver life-saving humanitarian assistance. Humanitarian workers and assets must be respected. This entails taking active steps to spare them. Attacking them directly is strictly prohibited and can amount to war crimes. We call on all parties to urgently assess these incidents so they do not happen again. Mr. President, Excellencies, these attacks happened as violence against civilians is increasing across the country. Drones have struck public buses in Kherson, killing people on their way to work. In Poltava, first responders who came to put out a fire at a gas facility were killed alongside the workers they were trying to help. Short-range drones killed more civilians in April alone than in any other month since February 2022. On May 14, as you have just heard from DPPA, the population of Kyiv faced deadly, large-scale attacks that killed and injured scores of civilians, including children, as you've heard. We commend the work of national first responders in their efforts to continue to rescue civilians. Mr. President, the rules of war are binding to all parties to armed conflict and aim to limit human suffering and spare those who are not fighting. When clearly marked humanitarian convoys, civilians going about their daily lives, and first responders rushing to help are killed and injured again and again, this shows a pattern that defies international humanitarian law. Civilians and civilian objects must be spared, must be respected. Mr. President, despite the dangers, we continue to deliver humanitarian assistance wherever access allows. Since February 2022, the United Nations and our partners have carried out 250 humanitarian convoys to frontline communities. In April alone, the World Food Programme provided nearly 160,000 people with food across 7 frontline regions. I remain deeply concerned about the situation for civilians in and around frontline communities. Whatever side of the line they may be, every day is a matter of life and death. Over a single weekend this month, 930 civilians, including more than 180 children, were evacuated from frontline areas in Donetsk with humanitarian support. OCHA can work with the parties on arrangements to support voluntary, dignified, safe evacuations and ensure safe and regular humanitarian access to frontline communities. Mr. President, humanitarian needs continue to grow, even as diplomatic efforts continue. We are reaching only a fraction of the 10.8 million people who need humanitarian assistance. We have received some $845 million of the $2.3 billion required. $1.7 billion is still needed. Funding is not simply about keeping operations ongoing. It determines whether civilians trapped near the front line receive medical care. It determines whether families displaced by fighting can stabilize their lives. And it determines whether humanitarian organizations can remain present where the needs are greatest. Mr. President, my ask to this Council, not new. First, please use your influence to ensure that international humanitarian law is respected. Wars have rules, they are unequivocal. This means ensuring the protection of civilians, including by allowing them to voluntarily leave for safer areas. This means ensuring rapid, unimpeded humanitarian access to civilians in need wherever they are. We need the active engagement of parties to facilitate this. Without immediate action, it will become even harder to deliver aid, and civilian suffering will deepen. Second, provide timely funding. Delays in funding force impossible choices about who receives assistance and who does not. Mr. President, Excellencies, civilians across Ukraine cannot wait for a political breakthrough to be protected and to have their basic needs met. Protection, humanitarian access, funding remain essential while efforts towards a just and lasting peace continue. I thank you.
I thank Ms. Wosornu for her briefing. I now give the floor to those concerned